The crimes of serial killers need no embellishment to enhance their impact. They are inherently unsettling. The case of Jeffrey Dahmer is a clear example, though its details are particularly morbid regardless of the tone in which they are told. Accounts invariably mention the heads of his victims hidden in his refrigerator or his acts of cannibalism, but there are still several horrific details that the specialized press chose not to report. While media sensationalism was part of this story from the very beginning, even the most seasoned journalists of the era had to think twice before writing their columns. To say that the particulars of this case might offend certain sensibilities is too light a warning, too gentle a way to describe what Dahmer did to his victims. One of the great questions surrounding the case is whether we are dealing with a calculating psychopath or a mentally ill man incapable of understanding the scope of his actions. As the serial killer John Wayne Gacy would say in an interview, "If Jeffrey Dahmer isn't considered insane, then I don't know who is." In mid-1990, the citizens of Racine, Wisconsin were left stunned by a heinous crime. Joachim Dressler, 43, murdered a young man named James Madden, 24, as he was collecting funds for an environmental group in his neighborhood. After killing him, Dressler dismembered the body, placed the remains in trash bags, and scattered them along various rural roads. When police raided his home, they found an enormous library of videos depicting sexual perversion, torture, mutilation, autopsies, accidents, and murders, which Dressler used for masturbation. The details that leaked out about this case held millions of Americans mesmerized for months. So much so that in July 1991, a year later and during his trial, the story still occasionally made front-page news. But Dressler's macabre story would soon be overshadowed by one even worse, also occurring in the state of Wisconsin, specifically in Milwaukee. Around 11:30 on the night of Monday, July 22, 1991, police officers Rolf Mueller and Rout were about to end their shift in one of Milwaukee's most troubled neighborhoods. West Kilbourn Avenue was known as a hub for all manner of theft, drug trafficking, prostitution, and even shootings. Mueller and Rout were in their patrol car when a thin, short African-American man approached them, staggering. Tracy Edwards, 32, had a single handcuff dangling from one of his wrists and seemed disoriented. He told the officers that he had been at a strange man's apartment and that the man had handcuffed him. Both officers decided to accompany him to the Oxford Apartments at 924 North 25th Street, a three-story structure that appeared well-maintained. Upon entering the hallways, they immediately caught an overpowering and, at the same time, indescribable stench. Their trained noses had often detected the scent of death. They were veterans with over 10 years of experience as law enforcement officers. But the pestilence that filled the building was very strange, and neither Rout nor Mueller could immediately associate it with the presence of a decomposing body. The Oxford apartment complex was a relatively quiet and clean place compared to other buildings in the area. It was rarely visited by the police, and all its tenants were African American, with the exception of a strange, tall, blond man who lived in apartment 213, whom everyone referred to as that weird white guy. His name was Jeffrey Dahmer. Guided by Tracy Edwards, the officers knocked on the door of apartment 213 to find out what had happened. Rout and Mueller believed it was simply a domestic dispute, perhaps a BDSM game that had gotten out of control. However, they were not prepared for what they were about to discover. When the door opened, Dahmer looked at the officers with a puzzled expression and let them in without making any excuses. The place was quite tidy for a bachelor's apartment, though the strange smell from the hallway seemed even more intense inside. One of the officers asked for the keys to the handcuffs, hoping to resolve the matter and leave without issuing a citation. Dahmer told them the keys were in his bedroom, but before he could go get them, Tracy Edwards warned the police that it was in that very room that the man had threatened him with a knife. Officer Mueller told Dahmer to stay put and went to the bedroom himself. As he entered, he glanced inside an open dresser drawer. What he saw there would give him nightmares for months. It was a collection of nearly 30 Polaroid photographs showing various men, dismembered and decapitated. He immediately yelled to his partner to cuff the apartment's owner, but the suspect tried to flee. Rout and Dahmer tumbled to the floor, but the officer quickly subdued him. Mueller came out of the bedroom with the photographs in his hand and showed them to his partner and to Tracy Edwards, telling him, "You're lucky. You could have been next." Edwards couldn't believe his eyes and instantly remembered how Dahmer had gotten angry when he had tried to open the refrigerator to get a beer. "Maybe he has one of those heads in there," he told the police. Mueller looked at him with disbelief and opened the refrigerator door to check. The officer would later recall hearing a scream when he opened the fridge and saw a human head inside. In reality, it was he who had screamed, but he couldn't remember doing it. The shrieks that escaped the officer were heard even by the neighbors, who were already aware that something was happening in apartment 213. An hour later, around 1 in the morning, the place was surrounded by patrol cars and even fire trucks. Several tenants of the Oxford apartments were out on the street, clad in their bathrobes, discussing the gruesome discovery. The rumor that Milwaukee police had found a human head inside a refrigerator spread like wildfire, and soon journalists and television crews appeared, sensing that this would become a new Dressler case. They interviewed neighbors who confirmed that Dahmer was an odd guy, who walked in a peculiar way with his arms always tight against his body and his shoulders hunched forward, but that he had never been violent or rude. A young man told a reporter he had seen him throwing plastic bags into the building's dumpster, and that a score of cats had gathered to eat some of the remains. Those who lived on the same floor as Dahmer knew he had a large fish tank, and the boy assumed it might have been fish food. It was also thought that the fish tank might be the source of the strange odor, though Dahmer himself had spoken to the building manager after a complaint was filed, claiming that a piece of meat had spoiled in his refrigerator and that no matter how much he cleaned it, he couldn't get rid of the stench. One of the neighbors said that Dahmer would open his apartment door just enough to slip in and out, then quickly shut it. She thought he did it for privacy, but it was apparently to keep the odor from seeping into the hallways. They also stated they never saw him with a girl, leading the more curious to assume he was gay. Pamela Bass, the woman who lived directly across from Dahmer, recalled constantly hearing the sound of a saw. On one occasion, around 2 a.m., she was woken by the noise. She banged on the door of apartment 213 and yelled at its owner to do his work during the day, but he never answered. All of these behaviors were strange, but apparently not particularly alarming. People who passed him would greet him, and he would respond politely. He was never seen agitated, nervous, or giving the impression he was hiding something. The police officers conducted a thorough search of Dahmer's apartment and came across several unpleasant surprises they would never forget. The kitchen, dining room, and main living area were a single open space and were relatively clean, aside from a couple of beer cans and some full ashtrays. The next day, when the carpeting was removed, enormous bloodstains were discovered to have soaked through the wooden floor. On the living room walls hung a pair of black and white photographs of bodybuilders in various poses, as well as a lithograph by the painter Salvador Dali depicting an infernal world and other curious pictures. In one corner stood a lava lamp, and on a table sat a large fish tank. The fish of different colors and sizes appeared well fed and cared for. Inside the refrigerator, Officer Mueller had discovered a perfectly preserved head, but upon opening the upper freezer compartment, they found 3 more heads wrapped in plastic bags, along with a pair of biceps and a human heart. In the bedroom closet was a metal container filled with liquid containing several decomposed hands and a penis. They also found 2 skulls and several jars of formaldehyde containing male genitalia. In a computer box, they stumbled upon 2 more human skulls. 3 more would be found inside a metal filing cabinet, along with various bones. But perhaps the source of the pestilence in the Oxford apartments originated from a huge, 55-gallon blue drum in Dahmer's bedroom. Submerged inside in a kind of chemical sludge were parts of human bodies partially dissolved. The smell of the chemical waste combined with that of decomposition had managed to confuse the police and many of the residents. In addition to the 30 Polaroid photos found in the dresser, an equally horrific photo album was discovered, filled with grotesque images. In some, his victims appeared alive, dressed in a black bikini and in sexual poses, but in others they lay handcuffed, naked, and unconscious. The most explicit showed several male bodies decapitated and split open from throat to pelvis, completely disemboweled. There was also a disturbing photo session of a human head next to its 2 hands and its penis. In others, Dahmer had placed 2 skulls on a plate with various food seasonings and also inside the refrigerator. Other images showed a completely flayed body and a corpse on the bed arched backward in an impossible posture. There was also a photograph of a perfectly clean skeleton hanging in the bathroom, but with the flesh of its face, scalp, hands, and feet still intact. Besides several beer cans, VHS tapes, and homosexual pornography magazines on the bed was the camera with which the killer photographed his victims. Beneath it, officers found the knife Dahmer had used to threaten Tracy Edwards. The suspect had already been taken to the police department, which was quite nearby. Meanwhile, the crowd of onlookers and reporters outside the building continued to grow. Around 4 a.m. on Tuesday, the fire department's hazardous materials brigade arrived on the scene, along with other specialists in toxic waste handling. Their main mission was to remove the barrel of chemical sludge and human remains from Dahmer's room. The crowd watched in disbelief as 2 men in yellow suits, masks, and oxygen tanks entered the building to do their work. It looked as if they were entering a radioactive zone, while some people in their sleepwear still milled about the property, gawking. A short while later, a few muffled screams were heard as the hazmat specialists emerged with a freezer full of human remains. Then they brought out a barrel containing bodies submerged in acid. Some police officers carried several cardboard boxes, one of them labeled with the word skull on its side, while a lock of hair was clearly visible sticking out of another. The neighbors were in shock, having lived with such a serial killer right under their noses. Some of them didn't even want to return to their apartments, especially considering the stench still lingered in the hallways. At that point, the total number of Dahmer's victims was unknown, though it was estimated to be at least 11, more than enough for the press to realize this was an exceptional case. The news of the discovery at the Oxford apartment complex was on every magazine and newspaper cover in the United States, causing a massive stir. Television news programs updated the status of the investigation hour by hour, until the name Jeffrey Dahmer was finally leaked to the media, who would dub him the Milwaukee Butcher. This would be the beginning of a new story of serial murder in North America, possibly one of the most horrifying and twisted. Although he had tried to flee at the time of his capture, Dahmer seemed relieved to have been stopped. He knew he could no longer cope with his fantasies or the murderous frenzy that was consuming him. Once at the police department, he agreed to cooperate and assist in all aspects of the case investigation. He confessed to murdering a total of 17 men and teenagers between 1978 and 1991. According to his initial statements, he had drugged most of them with chloroform or sleeping pills. He would then strangle them, have sexual relations with the corpse, and dismember it. Many of the remains ended up in the trash, though he kept the parts that interested him most in his apartment. He also admitted to committing acts of cannibalism. The key question was, who were these victims? Dahmer said he didn't know their names, though he claimed they were young men he had met at various gay bars, bus stops, or bookstores whom he would invite to his apartment with the promise of alcohol and some erotic photographs in exchange for money. At that very moment, several pathologists and forensic experts were working diligently to identify the remains. Not even 48 hours had passed since Dahmer's arrest, and the case was already causing an enormous uproar. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born in Wisconsin on May 21, 1960. In 1967, Jeffrey Dahmer and his family relocated to Bath, Ohio, where they eventually settled into a new life. From a young age, he emerged as an outgoing, intelligent, and restless child, harboring a peculiar fascination with insects, which he preserved in jars of formalin. At 8 years old, this interest deepened when his father, Lionel Dahmer, gifted him a children's chemistry set, leading him to experiment further. Gradually, his curiosity extended to larger animals, squirrels, cats, raccoons, and dogs, though he did not torture them as some serial killers do in their youth. Instead, he collected those he found dead in the woods or on the roadside, stowing them in trash bags and bringing them home. Using chemicals, he bleached their bones and concealed them in the forest, deriving quiet pleasure from dissecting these remains. Much of his childhood and adolescence was devoted to this macabre hobby, transforming his family's spacious yard into an impromptu animal graveyard, where he even impaled dog heads among the bushes. Yet, as he grew, his obsession took a darker turn, compelling him to wonder about the inner workings of the human body. It was during puberty that Dahmer realized his attraction to men, a discovery that made him deeply uncomfortable. He kept it hidden, all the while harboring fantasies of opening the abdomen of a boy his age to gaze upon the organs within. He would sometimes rest his head on the chests of other boys, listening to their heartbeats, an act that strangely aroused him. By 15, he had become a consummate alcoholic, sipping whiskey in class and though often solitary. He occasionally drew the attention of a group with his antics. He frequently feigned mental retardation or cerebral palsy to shock people in public, or photobombed classes he didn't belong to, eliciting laughter from those in the know. This behavior earned him notoriety as the school clown, amassing a small following that celebrated his Dahmerisms, though they soon grew bored and cast him aside. Some girls found him attractive, but his distant, cold demeanor and grotesque sense of humor quickly drove them away. As Dahmer turned 18, his family unraveled amid turmoil. His mother, Joyce, struggled with bipolar disorder and severe anxiety, relying heavily on medication and having been hospitalized multiple times, eventually distancing herself from her eldest son. Lionel, weary of the constant conflicts, left the home and initiated divorce proceedings. While they battled over custody of their younger son, David, Jeffrey felt more abandoned than ever, spending weeks alone in the house after his mother moved away with his brother. During this isolating period, he fixated on a young man who jogged nearby each morning. One day he lay in wait with a baseball bat, intending to knock him unconscious and explore his body. Fate intervened when the jogger didn't appear that day, sparing his life. Dahmer abandoned the plan and never tried again, though his father began visiting regularly, sensing his son's homosexuality and offering quiet support despite his uncertainty. In June 1978, while driving along a highway, Dahmer spotted Stephen Hicks hitchhiking shirtless in the sweltering heat, a scene that mirrored one of his long-held fantasies. Without hesitation, he stopped and offered a ride. They conversed easily, and soon Hicks agreed to join him for beers and marijuana at his home. They spent the night listening to music, drinking, and smoking, eventually engaging in consensual sex, according to Dahmer. The next morning, as Hicks prepared to leave, Dahmer's pleas failed and panic overtook him. A violent struggle ensued. Dahmer struck Hicks with a dumbbell, rendering him unconscious, then strangled him with the bar. Feeling rejected and desperate for connection, even in death, Dahmer violated the body over several days. Realizing he needed to dispose of the remains, he dismembered them, but first he indulged in his depraved urges, masturbating while gazing at the intestines. That night, he loaded the bags into his car and drove off, only to be pulled over by police for erratic driving. To his astonishment, the officer merely issued a ticket after a routine check, accepting Dahmer's claim that the bags contained mere trash and let him go. Shaken but undeterred, Dahmer returned home and hid the remains under the basement pipes. Hicks's family searched for him in vain, and his case entered Milwaukee's police database without resolution. Soon after, amid the divorce, Lionel enrolled Jeffrey in Ohio University, but his alcoholism led to his withdrawal after one semester. The following year, Lionel persuaded him to join the army, where he served 2 years in Germany before being discharged. Back in Milwaukee, Dahmer struggled to rebuild, but his drinking spiraled, numbing his dark fantasies and profound loneliness. He felt remorse for killing Hicks, vowing celibacy and attending church regularly, even exhuming and destroying the hidden remains to ease his guilt, though it brought no relief. His father, Lionel, remained a steadfast presence, trying to guide him through his sexuality. But Dahmer's deeper issues persisted. He briefly lived in Florida, but it didn't last, and he returned to Ohio, where arrests mounted for disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. By 1982, he moved in with his grandmother, Catherine, in West Allis, Wisconsin, staying for 7 years. They got along reasonably well. He helped with chores and secured a job at a Milwaukee blood bank. That year, he was arrested for indecent exposure in a theme park while intoxicated, paying a modest fine. In 1985, he found stable work as a mixer at Ambrosia Chocolate. But by 1986, he was charged with lewd behavior after masturbating in front of 2 12-year-old boys by a river. He admitted to similar acts and sought psychological help, receiving a suspended sentence in therapy. Dahmer began frequenting gay saunas where he drugged partners and abused them while unconscious, leading to his banishment after one victim fell into a coma. Though no charges were filed due to the victim's reluctance to come forward. In November 1987, he met Stephen Tuomi in a gay bar. They spent the night in a motel and Tuomi was dead by morning, though Dahmer claimed no memory of the act. Panicked, he bought a large suitcase, transported the body to his grandmother's basement, abused it, dismembered it, and discarded the parts. 2 months later, he lured Jamie Dockstader, a 14-year-old claiming to be 18, to the basement for erotic photos, drugged and strangled him, then disposed of the remains. In March 1988, Richard Guerrero met the same fate. His grandmother grew weary of the constant stream of men and his erratic behavior, discovering a mannequin he used for gratification. She confided in Lionel, who pressured Jeffrey to move out. On September 25, 1988, he relocated to a modest apartment, but within 24 hours he offered money to a 13-year-old boy for photos, drugged him, and assaulted him. The boy escaped and Dahmer was arrested at work. Despite his denials, he was placed on probation after his father paid a fine, though the case lingered. Lionel, horrified, hired attorney Gerald Boyle to urge a guilty plea and psychiatric treatment. On January 30, 1989, Dahmer pleaded guilty, awaiting sentencing on May 23. But on March 25, he killed Anthony Sears, following his pattern, meeting him at a gay club, drugging and strangling him in the basement, abusing the body and preserving the skull as a trophy. Both Lionel and Boyle recognized the ominous trajectory of his actions, yet the full extent of his darkness remained hidden. The psychologists who interviewed Dahmer at the time agreed they were dealing with someone who harbored a great deal of rage and struggled with his sexuality. They warned that he showed no interest in rehabilitating from his alcoholism and was likely to reoffend. But when he stood before the judge, his full manipulative prowess was on brilliant display. He claimed to be utterly repentant for what he had done, professing that he deserved an exemplary punishment, and that his problems were largely fueled by excessive drinking. He stated his willingness to accept a sentence but pleaded to be allowed to keep his job, lest his life be destroyed. He also appeared open to receiving psychological and psychiatric help, insisting that he wanted to change and never commit such an act again. His performance worked better than expected. Instead of sending him directly to prison, the judge sentenced him to 5 years in a rehabilitation center with permission to continue working at Ambrosia Chocolate. He was also ordered to seek psychological help, undergo treatment for his alcoholism, report monthly to his case officer, and avoid all contact with anyone under the age of 18. 10 months later, despite his own father's intervention to prevent his early release, Jeffrey Dahmer managed to sway the judge with a letter, assuring him that he had changed. On March 2, 1990, Dahmer returned to his grandmother's house. She took him in, but on one condition, that he immediately find another place to live. 2 months later, he moved into apartment 213 of the Oxford Apartments on North 25th Street. It was there that he would perfect his murderous techniques, elevating them to the height of the grotesque. As was his custom, he frequented gay bars, convincing young men to return to his apartment to pose for erotic photographs. Once there, he would drug them and strangle them, either with his bare hands or with a leather belt he had purchased for that specific purpose. But now, living alone with complete privacy, he decided to experiment further with his victims. He would sexually abuse them after they were dead, and then photograph them in various poses. He would also disembowel them, aroused by the warmth emanating from their entrails. He would even masturbate amidst the intestines of the corpses. He took photographs of the dismemberment process, which he then kept in a photo album. Some of these images revealed a deliberate attempt at artistry, though they only succeeded in exposing the terrible depth of his sickness. He began boiling heads in a pot to more easily remove the flesh, keeping the skulls in his room, before which he would masturbate. He preserved penises in formaldehyde, painting them flesh-toned if they were too decomposed. In the case of Ernest Mueller, he skinned him and ate his biceps because he found them large and wanted to try cannibalism. Unsurprisingly, Dahmer's apartment exuded an unbearable stench, a fact he was well aware of. He disposed of what he could in the building's dumpster, but numerous human remains were still hidden inside his home. He then bought a large barrel and filled it with acid, hoping to dissolve the remains and flush them down the toilet. While this partially solved the problem of accumulating bodies, the foul odor could still be smelled throughout the building's hallway. Though Dahmer's systematic killings were becoming routine, following an almost identical pattern, one occasion broke the mold. He murdered a 22-year-old named David Thomas, a man to whom he felt no sexual attraction. He brought him home, drugged him, killed him, and dismembered his body while taking photographs, before throwing the remains in the trash. He did not have sex with the corpse, nor did he keep any part of it. At the same time, he began experimenting on his victims in even more atrocious ways. After drugging them while they were still alive, he would drill a hole into their skull and inject hydrochloric acid or boiling water directly into their brain with a syringe. His goal was to transform them into will-less zombies, to keep them alive so he could sexually abuse them without resistance. Only one man managed to survive these crude trepanations for more than 2 hours. But Dahmer's sadism was no longer limited to the physical. Several victims' parents told investigators they had received anonymous phone calls from a man telling them their sons were dead. After his capture, Dahmer himself admitted to making the calls, having found their numbers in press releases about the disappearances. On May 27, 1991, around 2 a.m., a 911 call alerted police to a boy wandering completely naked and seemingly injured on the street. When a pair of officers arrived, they saw that he was unsteady on his feet and unable to speak coherently. The police report noted only a small cut on one of his knees, which witnesses said came from a fall. Jeffrey Dahmer, who had gone out to buy beer, approached the scene and claimed the boy was his guest and was simply drunk. An ambulance arrived, but the paramedics who examined him saw no need for hospitalization and left after a few minutes. The police officers accompanied Dahmer back to apartment 213 to verify that the two knew each other. Upon entering, the boy sat down on a couch of his own accord. His neatly folded clothes were on it. The apartment appeared clean, and Dahmer showed them Polaroid pictures of his guest posing in a black bikini. This was enough for the officers to leave, assuming the two were a couple. But something was terribly wrong. Dahmer had told police the young man was 19, when in fact he was only 14. This fact would be heavily criticized once the case came to light. Neither officer had asked for identification to verify the boy's age, effectively handing him over to the killer, who strangled him just minutes after they left. They also failed to check Dahmer's criminal record, which would have alerted them. Despite noticing the apartment's stench, it never occurred to them to conduct a search. A simple look under his bed would have revealed the body of Tony Hughes, another of his victims who had been decomposing for 3 days. And worst of all, the victim, Conorak Syntha of Laotian descent, was the brother of the boy whom Jeffrey Dahmer had drugged and abused in 1988. Police incompetence had led to a terrible coincidence, one that would have grave consequences. The final weeks of Dahmer's freedom were dramatic. He had been fired from his job at Ambrosia Chocolate for absenteeism and chronic lateness. He was severely depressed and rarely attended his court-ordered therapy sessions. He had lost weight, was drinking heavily, and feared eviction, as he had no money to pay the rent. 2 months later, on July 22nd, it would all be over. Dahmer had claimed a total of 17 lives over 13 years, yet he had come close to being caught on numerous occasions. It seemed to be more than just good luck. For the African American and Asian communities, to which many of the victims belonged, the police were to blame. Racial tensions were not uncommon in Milwaukee, but when the full story was revealed, the situation became untenable. Several officers were dismissed, especially those involved in the tremendous error of the Syntha case. Still, no one was satisfied. Of the victims, 10 were African American, 3 were Caucasian, 1 was Asian, 1 was Native American, and 2 were Hispanic. In total, the remains of 11 people were found in apartment 213 of the Oxford building. The Dahmer case quickly became a major headache for investigators. Beyond the terrible mistakes already made, it threatened to become even larger than it appeared. On July 27, 1981, Adam Walsh, a boy of only 6, was abducted from a shopping mall in Florida. His decapitated head was later found in a drainage canal beside a highway. This is arguably one of the most controversial criminal cases in the United States, and a major stir was created when it was discovered that Dahmer was living in Florida when Adam Walsh disappeared. Until then, the boy's killer was unknown, and many began to suspect Dahmer, though he denied everything. There was even evidence that he had been at the mall on the day the boy vanished. In another macabre coincidence, it would later be proven that not only was Dahmer at the mall that day, but so was another famous serial killer, Otis Toole. After his arrest, Toole confessed to Adam Walsh's murder, though he later recanted. For the boy's father, John Walsh, who would go on to create and host the television show America's Most Wanted, Otis Toole was his son's killer. Still, doubts persist. Furthermore, when Dahmer was in the army in Germany, several female bodies were discovered, strangled and stabbed in the vicinity. The crime ceased shortly after he returned to the United States. Experts are certain these murders were not committed by Dahmer, as the victim profile did not match his. Even so, his former military colleagues recalled that he would sometimes disappear for hours and behave strangely. Although unlikely, an investigation into his connection to these cases was attempted but yielded no results. The police reserved an entire wing of the prison for Jeffrey Dahmer. Overnight, he had become their most famous inmate. When he was moved from one place to another, all the prisoners would come to the doors of their cells and watch him in disoriented. There was a mixture of respect, curiosity, and fear surrounding him. Even some of the guards felt uneasy in his presence. The media had dubbed him the Butcher of Milwaukee and later the Milwaukee Cannibal, but in prison the inmates called him the Meat Grinder. When one of them would try to taunt him as he was being escorted by guards, Dahmer would retort, "I wish I had gotten you." The authorities were aware of the risk he faced behind bars and made sure to keep him isolated from the general population, at least until the trial began. Demonstrations filled the streets of Milwaukee, supporting the victims' families and blaming police ineptitude, accusing them of being racist and prejudiced. They argued that if Dahmer had been African American or Hispanic, and his victims white, he would have been arrested much sooner. Club 219, where Dahmer picked up several of his victims, was vandalized, and the door of apartment 213, where he lived, was shot several times with a revolver. The citizens of Milwaukee were enraged. There was also talk that Dahmer himself hated African Americans for their skin color, but he flatly denied it. In fact, he claimed he found some of them attractive, which is why he chose them as victims. Still, some people who knew him claimed to have heard him utter racial slurs on more than one occasion. It is, however, very likely that he was genuinely attracted to them. At the same time, some specialists believed he envied his victims because they seemed to enjoy their sexuality openly. But what all the psychologists who analyzed his personality agreed upon was that he felt tremendously alone. By killing them, he prevented them from abandoning him. By eating parts of their bodies, they remained perpetually inside him. By preserving their remains in jars or in his refrigerator, they belonged to him. And through the Polaroid photos, he could remember them whenever he wished. Jeffrey Dahmer would plead guilty but insane to all crimes, so the trial focused primarily on determining whether he would end up in prison or a mental institution. The proceedings began on January 27, 1992. One of the most dramatic parts of the trial was Dahmer's revelations in front of the victims' families. As painful as it was, they wanted to know how and why their sons or brothers had died, which proved to be a tremendously unpleasant and traumatic experience. The details were truly grotesque. Beyond the horror of the crimes, perhaps the only solace was the fact that most of Dahmer's victims died while unconscious. For the killer, the fun began after they were already dead, so he did not prolong the process, with the exception of those subjected to trepanation and the injection of acid into their brains. In his effort to cooperate, Dahmer tried not to hide or omit any detail. Soon, the ghastliness of the confessions began to affect those present at the trial. Members of the jury felt unwell and reported having nightmares, but certain oddities revealed that, to some extent, Dahmer was displaying a very twisted sense of humor. He attended one of the hearings wearing one of his victims' shirts. He also explained that he wore yellow contact lenses because he was an admirer of the Emperor from the Star Wars saga. At the same time, he was obsessed with the film The Exorcist III, which also features a scene alluding to a demonic, yellow-eyed gaze. It was proven that Dahmer had brought pieces of corpses and even severed heads to his job at Ambrosia Chocolate, hiding them in his locker. This seemed to make no sense and was part of the evidence the defense presented to argue that the accused was sick, not a cold and calculating psychopath. Several of Dahmer's former co-workers testified that he sometimes brought meat sandwiches to work and refused to share them. The only person he ever offered one of these sandwiches to was his neighbor, Pamela Bass, the same woman who had once asked him to stop making noise with his power saw. To this day, Bass has chosen not to know if the sandwich contained human flesh, despite Dahmer himself offering to clarify the matter during a prison visit. Initially, Dahmer claimed to have engaged in cannibalism only once, a statement he later retracted. In fact, he had developed several recipes using various seasonings. Inside his refrigerator, alongside severed heads, investigators found patties made of human meat. Shortly before his capture, he had been planning to create a kind of altar. His vision included 2 complete skeletons and 10 skulls arranged on a black table, adorned with incense and decorative lights. Although he considered himself an atheist and had shown interest in the occult on more than one occasion, this seemed to be just another of his dark eccentricities. During the trial, his defense pointed to Dahmer's irresponsible and self-destructive behaviors to argue for a plea of insanity. He would drink until he blacked out, squandered his money, and lived a lifestyle as reckless as that of his victims. On one occasion, he mistakenly drank from a cup he had laced with narcotics, only to wake up and find all his money stolen. Another time, he accepted a drink from a man at a bar and lost consciousness. He came to, completely naked and bound, hanging upside down, while the man sodomized him with a large candle. Miraculously, the stranger let him go, despite several experts at the trial believing Jeffrey Dahmer was mentally ill. Public pressure demanded a prison sentence. Even FBI agent Robert Dressler, who advised the defense, offered his view. He believed the accused was insane but still responsible for his actions, and should be committed to a mental institution. On February 14th, Judge Graham read the jury's verdict. Jeffrey Dahmer was found guilty of 15 murders and deemed legally sane. He would be sent to prison. An hour before the sentence was handed down, the victims' families were given the chance to address the killer. Most of the statements were reflective, remembering their loved ones while not hiding their rage and helplessness. But Rita Isbell, the sister of 19-year-old Errol Lindsay, murdered by Dahmer in March of 1991, could not contain herself. "I'm furious," she seethed. "This is how you act when you lose control. I don't want to see my mother have to go through this again. Never, Jeffrey. I hate you. I hate you." Isbell lunged menacingly toward the defense table and had to be restrained by guards. Through it all, Dahmer remained motionless in what became one of the most tense moments of the entire trial. The accused then read a letter in which he expressed remorse for his crimes, but he failed to move anyone. His monotonous tone of voice gave no indication that he was even remotely affected by the situation. He was ultimately sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences, totaling 957 years in prison. He was sent to the Columbia Correctional Institution, where he spent much of his time in isolation for his own safety. After a while, he requested permission to join the general population. It was a risk, but keeping him in total isolation was also seen as detrimental to his mental health. The main problem was that several inmates, particularly African-American prisoners, wanted him dead. Dahmer was known for a very dark sense of humor, which earned him the antipathy of many. He would mold his food into the shape of human body parts, or warn guards that he might bite them. He survived a razor attack in August of 1994 with only minor injuries. But on November 28th of that same year, his luck ran out. Christopher Scarver, a fellow inmate suffering from schizophrenia, attacked him with a metal bar from the weight room, striking him twice in the head. Dahmer died on the way to the hospital at the age of 34. He was killed with the same type of weapon he had used years earlier to take the life of Stephen Hicks, his very first victim. His brain was preserved for a time for study but was eventually given to his father, Lionel, who chose to have it cremated. The man, deeply affected by his son's death, wrote a truly moving book called A Father's Story, which reveals the suffering of another collateral victim of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes. Due to the infamy of the Oxford apartments following the gruesome discoveries, no one wanted to live there. The building was eventually demolished in an effort to erase this terrible story from the collective memory. Various studies showed that Dahmer possessed a surprisingly high IQ of 145, yet it was clear his emotional intelligence was practically non-existent. His obsessions and twisted fantasies were likely the reflection of a diseased mind. In his book, Whoever Fights Monsters, Robert Dressler reflects deeply on the killer's personality, including excerpts from his interviews. He details how Dahmer would attempt to be coherent but would periodically become disoriented. At times, he couldn't even speak without taking long pauses during which, according to the specialist, he would enter catatonic states. The figure of Dahmer has become one of the most unsettling in criminology, partly because he did not display the typical traits of a serial killer during his childhood. Anne Schwartz, a journalist and author of the book, The Man Who Couldn't Kill Enough, stated that no matter how deeply she delved into his childhood, she could find no particularly traumatic event that might explain his deviant behavior. Faced with the classic question of whether a serial killer is born or made, we are left only to reflect. I'll leave a link to my criminology blog and also a link to purchase my book, Human Monsters, a 430-page volume where I explore the subject of serial killers in depth. My name is Alvaro, and this is the Crime Channel. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of my new videos.